Hello there, my name is Jade Vaughn, and this is my final project for ESOC 214. Today we'll be looking at Umbrella's Dossier, which is a data analysis of narrative complexity across the Resident Evil franchise. Here's a quick overview of what I'll be covering. I'll walk through my introduction, my research question, methods, and 5 visualizations, and then we'll close out with limitations and next steps. So I've been a Resident Evil fan for a long time, and when I found the dataset on Kaggle, I was really excited to utilize it for the project. For me, Resident Evil kind of started with the movies and then later the games. But yeah, my research question is which Resident Evil games have the most complex narratives based on the number of scenes and character interactions? The dataset covers 14 games with over 1,500 scenes and nearly as many character interaction records. Each row in the scenes table is one scripted scene, and each row in the interactions table is a named character appearing in that scene. For my methods, I loaded 5 CSV files and joined them into one complexity summary table. I converted the game type column to a factor for consistent ordering, and I created a new variable called interactions per scene, which divides total interactions by scene count. That one ended up being really useful because, as we can see, 2 games, Revelations and Revelations 2, had no transcript data, so they show up as NA and are thus excluded from the visuals. My first visualization is the most straightforward one, total scene count per game. So we can see that Resident Evil Requiem, which was released earlier this year, dominates the chart with 646 scenes, and that's nearly 3 times the next closest title. But what's interesting is that Resident Evil 6 sits near the bottom with only 10 scenes. And as a fan, and I'm sure many others can tell you, that's actually the longest game in the franchise by gameplay completion time, just because there's multiple campaigns. And so that disconnect is important because it tells us scene count here reflects transcript coverage and not gameplay length. So action-heavy games have fewer documented scenes because more of their runtime is combat rather than dialogue. And we'll see later that this could also point to how the transcripts could possibly be sourced. If they're not sourced from the same source, then they're not going to have completed data, or they're not maybe all going to be documented correctly. So plot 2 brings in a second dimension, unique character count. Requiem has 646 scenes, but only 6 unique characters, so it's a very focused cast with an extremely long script. And then Resident Evil 4 has 14 unique characters, which is the most in the entire dataset, but only 18 scenes. Resident Evil 2 is actually the most balanced entry with 10 characters and 80 scenes. And so the key takeaway here is that scene count and character diversity really don't move together, which means narrative complexity is more multidimensional than any single metric can capture. Plot 3 looks at who those characters are by role. So the appearances table categorizes each character as a hero, villain, or support figure. And so most games have a fairly balanced mix, but Resident Evil 6 and Resident Evil 5 stand out with noticeably high villain counts relative to their cast size. And that tracks if you've played those games, since both are known to have large, elaborate antagonistic rosters. So, put simply, there's a lot of boss fights and many villains and zombies that you have to fight within the game. And then plot four honestly is my favorite one. This variable measures how many character interactions per scene happen per scene on average. So Resident Evil 6 tops the chart with almost 4 interactions per scene, despite barely having any scenes total. Meanwhile, Requiem, which has the most scenes, has less than 1 interaction per scene on average because the cast is so small. So scene volume and scene intensity are actually 2 very different things, and this plot makes that really clear. So if you take Resident Evil 6, for instance, there is almost always an overlap with the characters because of the different campaigns. So you're always like kind of running into a character that would be from a different campaign because it's all happening simultaneously or similarly across the time frame. And then Resident Evil Requiem is very solo based, I suppose you could explain it like that, where you're either playing as Grace or you're playing as Leon, and there isn't a lot of interactions. You're kind of just going through the game. My last visualization looks at which individual characters appear most across all interactions in the dataset. And Grace Ashcroft from Requiem comes in first, which might seem surprising since she's only in one game, but there's a direct result from Requiem's 646 scenes dominating the dataset as we saw in the first visualization. Leon Kennedy is the second, and he's appeared across multiple games including Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4, and 6, among other games that weren't listed in this dataset. And the gap between them is really more of a story about data coverage than actual franchise importance, because Leon is almost certainly the true narrative background when you account for all of that. So, a few important limitations to flag. The data is built from transcripts only, so action sequences probably aren't captured, which is why games like Resident Evil 6 appear much lower than you'd expect. Resident Evil 6 has 3 separate campaigns that may not be fully accounted for in the source data, and 2 games are missing entirely from Revelations and Revelations 2. So these results reflect narrative density in transcripts, not overall game complexity. And that distinction really matters for interpreting the findings. The core takeaway from this project is that narrative complexity is genuinely multidimensional, as I mentioned previously. Scene count, character diversity, role composition, and interaction intensity all tell different stories about the same franchise, and they don't always agree. So if I were to extend this analysis, I'd want to normalize for gameplay length and investigate whether the transcript sources are consistent across the games. But yeah, thanks everyone.